This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
I think you can find in the experiences of whether it be Christian or faithful or whatever character it may be, you just have a way of finding yourself inside of their own thinking or the experience that they're wrapped up in.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well and really excited about what we're doing today, which is a beginning of a discussion through the Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. And we're both using the recent publication by Banner of Truth of this classic. And excited to propose a series of discussions that will stretch over who knows how long, maybe the next 18 months or more, in which on occasion we drop an episode just working through a set of scenes in the Pilgrim's Progress. So unlike some discussions we've had in the past, this is not a complete book overview in a one-stop episode, but we really want to talk about the Pilgrim's Progress from the city of destruction up to the wicket gate, which is the first little section. So looking forward to that, and also to be joined by a good friend of both of us and part of the Alliance, Jeff Stivason.
Yeah, when we talked about this Theology on the Go book club with Pilgrim's Progress, we knew that we had to find a way to include Jeff alongside us. He's done a lot more reading and thinking about Pilgrim's Progress than either you or I have. And Jeff, of course, is a professor at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, and also pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania. And so, again, as James said, we're planning to do this over a long period of time among the three of us, and to move through certain scenes or sections of the book. And we'd love for you to follow along with us as you read, and so that we can kind of engage in this really important book together. But anyway, Jeff, thanks for joining us for this conversation.
It's my pleasure to be here. Good to see you guys again, to be with you.
I want to start actually with an overarching question. We're going to move scene by scene, as James said, but I want to ask this question of Jeff, because you have spent quite a bit of time reading Pilgrim's Progress, reflecting on the various characters, reflecting on the overall themes in the book. What is it that keeps drawing you back to this book? Or what is it that what's the case that you would make to listeners or potential readers of the importance of this book by John Bunyan?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I really like about it is it's not necessarily a systematic theology. It's more of an order of experience, and I think that has a way of resonating with Christians as they walk this vale of tears. I think you can find in the experiences of whether it be Christian or faithful or whatever character it may be, you just have a way of finding yourself inside of their own thinking or the experience that they're wrapped up in. So it's an easy book to find yourself in. And I think it was Sinclair Ferguson once who said that if more people would read the Pilgrim's Progress, they would probably need less Christian counseling. And I have found that to be the case myself, not to denigrate at all Christian counseling, but to actually lift up the Pilgrim's Progress and to value it a bit more than we, I think, have a tendency to do.
Well, I think you made, obviously, your overall point is I think, well put and highly significant, but I think you began by saying it's not a systematic theology, and I think that's important too. Sometimes people can read this and they want to put it in systematic categories, and certainly Bunyan is thinking biblically throughout the book, but there are ways in which, of course, we might frame it slightly differently if were we to make a systematic theology of the Christian life. But you're right, this accomplishes something different from that and draws you in a different way. I don't know that I'd heard that Ferguson quote before, but I kind of like it. That's really well put.
Jeff, you said that it touches the order of experience. And so let's do this. Let's get into the first scene of the Christian's experience as opened by Bunyan. And for our listeners, we just want to talk today about City of Destruction, Slough of Despond, briefly Worldly Wiseman, and then also Wicket Gate. So that's our ambition in the next few minutes we have together. But let's start where Bunyan starts, and really where we all start, born dead in our trespasses and sins as native sons and daughters of the City of Destruction. So how do we find the Christian, even before his conversion? Would you say that, Jeff? Is this pre-conversion, the opening scene? He has a burden.
I think the opening scene is definitely pre-conversion, but he moves very quickly to conversion.
Onto the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do we find him? Like, he's not at his ease. So we open the scene and we find a man distressed. And why? Like, what's going on with him?
Yeah, he obviously he's obviously been reading a book that's troubling him, and the book that's troubling him is obviously the Bible, and it causes a couple of different conditions in him. It causes him to stand still, and that's a phrase that's interesting in and of itself. But he also realizes that he's going down to the grave, and those are two key lines that Bunyan's going to actually pick up and use in just a little bit of writing time. For instance, not to look ahead too much, but to focus on the condition of the man. He stands still, he doesn't know where to go. That same kind of terminology is picked up when Evangelist finds him just after his discussion with Mr. Worldly Wise Man. He's standing still, he doesn't know where to go. And then the other thing is that he says that he fears going down to the grave. Well, when he's talking with Pliable and Obstinate, he says, I perceive that you're going down to the grave. And so the terminology is really interesting. It's something obviously important to Bunyan as he's thinking about Christian's condition prior to conversion. He's thinking of this man as aimless, not knowing where to go as a result of having read about his condition, which means that he's going down to the grave. He's going to perish.
There's something striking given that the title is Pilgrim's Progress, which seems exactly antithetical to standing still.
Yeah. Well, what's really great is when he encounters Evangelist on the hillside of Mount Sinai, he's standing there, doesn't know where to go, standing still. And Evangelist tells him, now you stand there and I've got 3 things I want to tell you.
Yeah. Let's go back to his house in the City of Destruction. He sets out. What's the response? And then I want to connect this even to Christian experience generally. What's the response of his friends and relations? The ones who don't feel his burden with him. Yeah.
They're caught off guard, to say the least. He's going around the house weeping. He has this book in his hand. They think he's lost his mind. And that oftentimes sums it up, doesn't it? I mean, once the world has cut itself off, from whether you call it the imminent frame of Charles Taylor or, the third world of Philip Reef, once the world is devoid of spiritual moorings, right? They think you've lost your mind, that you're reaching for something that's not there. And so his wife thinks he's lost his mind, and he has no way of convincing her otherwise.
Jeff, we move from his wife and his children, and they're confused, and they as you said, they think he's lost his mind. They don't understand what's happening to him. But then he meets these 2 other characters early on when he's in the City of Destruction, Obstinate and Pliable, and Obstinate is against the whole idea of the Christian life, but Pliable actually indicates that he wants to go to heaven, but he is not experiencing what we've been introduced to already in terms of the weight of sin. So can you talk a little bit about Obstinate and Pliable, and particularly Pliable, because again, he does have this desire for heaven.
Yeah. When you think about when you think about Christian encountering both his wife and obstinate and pliable, one of the things that I think that you learn to do as a believer is interact with unbelievers. When you think about his wife, all he can say to his wife is what he's read in his book. And what does he do with obstinate and pliable? Well, obstinate just thinks he's a loon just like his wife, but pliable seems to be talking to him about spiritual things and actually urging him to tell him more and more about the celestial city. And he says, you know what, I'm just going to resort to reading from my book. And so the interesting thing is that there are two things here that make one ponder a bit about how to deal with an unbeliever like this. The first thing is that you got to wonder if Christian is wondering about the lack of burden on Pliable's back. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. But the second thing that you think about is as Christian is telling him about all of these things, Pliable says, these things are ravishing my heart. The interesting thing is that same line comes up later when Christian is talking to Piety at the House Beautiful. He says, these things are ravishing my heart. And so Bunyan is painting for us the picture of a guy that's questionable. And I think he's inviting us into the story in such a way that once we read the story as a whole, we come back to this incident with Pliable and we say, this is one of those guys you just can't tell. And so how does Christian treat him? He treats him like a babe Christian who just needs more of the word. And so that's what he does. He keeps feeding him the word. He keeps telling him the answering the questions that he wants to hear. And it's really instructive, I think, because, we've all met those people that we're just not quite sure about. And I think the approach is let's just gently and faithfully and meaningfully give them more of God's word.
The big problem, it seems, with Pliable is you're right about how he's treated, but and that is instructive. But Pliable's big problem is he doesn't really have a conviction of sin. He doesn't feel the burden of sin and feel his pressing need to have that taken from him.
Yeah, no, I know. And but on the other hand, he's reacting rightly to these things in the word. So the question is are these things that he's hearing, are they going to actually produce for him this conviction of sin, right? Is this I think in one sense, this is a good approach to take for a Christian. You've heard about the rewards. Now let me give you more of the word, and let's see if that produces in you a conviction of sin and why you haven't been on this road beforehand.
So we know that Pliable doesn't continue with him. He begins to run, but then he stops pretty soon. So they very quickly, Obstinate has already turned back. And almost as soon as they're not quite even out of the city of destruction, or maybe they're just outside of it, but they enter into right away the Slough of Despond, which is really an intriguing scene because, well, for a few things, Pliable just crawls out. And I think it's striking that Bunyan says that he crawls out right back to his house and that his house was right beside the Slough of Despond. And you get this idea, like he seems either like shallow soil or like the cares of the world have choked it out. Something, he seems to be a mixture of both of those soils. Maybe he's playing both parts in the narrative, but he climbs out and he's not going to cross the Slough of Despond. He's not going to get to the other side. He's going to go home. So Jeff, what should we say the Slough of Despond is? And then also I want to add to that once he gets out to the other side of it and he asks, I'm trying to remember, is it the evangelist that he meets again? And the evangelist, and he says to the evangelist, why can't you get rid of this? I mean, right at the beginning of the Christian life, there's this whole Slough of Despond. And he says, basically, we have dumped so much sand into this. We have tried to fill this slough so that people don't cross through it. And you just have to go through it. So what is this slough why is it a Slough of Despond? And then why can't it be filled in, and how do they get out? All right, that's a lot, but.
Okay, that is a lot. Can I just make just a quick observation before we get to that point? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Do that. So I want to make a quick observation about the change in Christian from what you find in the opening chapter is pre-conversion days, where he talks about, and it's a difference in terms of the book itself. He talks about the Bible as a book in his hand, or the book, and he talks about it in a way that is distant from himself. But it's not until he meets with Pliable and Obstinate that he begins to, the language he uses about his book changes, not just his, but theirs. For instance, Obstinate says, away with your book. And then Christian talks about my book. And then when he's talking to Pliable, Christian says my book, and Pliable says your book. So there's a definite change in terminology that you can see the difference. It's really kind of striking. But okay, so
that's great.
Yeah. So what's the and I always call it slough.
You don't have to pronounce it the way James pronounces it. There's
fine,
slough.
Okay,
that's fine.
That's right. Whatever. So what is it? I think it's that anxiety-producing experience which accompanies the conviction of sin that a person feels when they first come to faith, and then feels periodically after. So that in one sense, the Slough of Despond could be anywhere along the path. And it can't be filled in, because this is part of that which remains, that will, it's the coming to grips with our justification and what that means for our life. And yet it's the remembrance of what has gone before. It's the remembrance of where we are and why, where we were. I think it's part of Christian experience. But anyway, I don't remember all the rest of it.
I mean, he finds somewhere to put his foot, even as he's moving through it.
Yeah.
So like, where does Pilgrim say plant his foot?
Yeah, these are the steps, right? The promises of God that come to fruition in faith and repentance. And so the interesting thing is, here's Christian in his early days, and Evangelist yanks him out of the Slough of Despond and says, why didn't you look for the steps, And later his wife and his kids will find those steps pretty easily, but he's still in these early days, and it's really kind of interesting. A lot of people still don't think he's quite a believer yet. They think that it's not until he goes through the wicket gate that he's a believer. But if you move ahead to the worldly wise man, it says in the margin there, it says the frame of the heart of a young Christian So Bunyan clearly sees him as a young Christian and who needs the help of his pastor in order to guide him through these difficult days of going through the slough.
If that brings us to one of the parts in the early section of this book that I think is the most interesting and instructive and helpful in terms of Christian discipleship, and that is Christian's encounter with worldly wise man, and he's fairly straightforward in a way, but then legality and civility, and so talk us through each of these encounters. Particularly legality and civility. I thought as I was rereading this in preparation for our discussion that legality and civility were particularly relevant for those who might be within the orbit of the Christian faith and kind of within the orbit of the church. And it's very easy to see how someone would substitute real Christianity or substitute civility and legality for real Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, because obviously the fruit of conversion, the fruit of coming to faith in Christ is a transformed life, a renovated life. And so when you think about what the fruit of genuine faith is, it's conduct, right? It's obedience to the law, bringing our lives into conformity with God's righteousness revealed in the commandments. So, here you have legality and civility, which are slightly different, and yet the net effect is the same, that this is a renovated life, not based upon the gospel,
right?
But built upon one's own merit.
Yeah, it's a striking thing. Because again, worldly wise man, he sort of diminishes the need to get rid of the burden in the way that the book tells him to go. But so he's promoting something that is very clearly antithetical. But you're right. I mean, legality and civility seem to promise some kind of new life. And Christian explores it a little bit.
He does. In fact, what becomes enticing to him is the fact that he can bring his wife and children with him. Yeah. And and one might read this and think to oneself, why isn't he concerned about his wife and children? Or maybe another question is, why isn't the church concerned about his wife and children? And again, this is not necessarily an order like we might say the slough can be along the path at any given point. And so House Beautiful can be along the path at any given point. And it's at House Beautiful where they're asked, where he's asked rather, by these three sisters, where's your wife and kids? And then they even challenge him more as if to say to him, could it be that you may be the cause of their not being here? And so the draw of having both the net effect of the Christian life without the foundation of it, without justification and all the rest, as well as having all of our earthly belongings and treasures is a pretty enticing thing.
So it's enticing. He goes and explores it. What happens when he gets there? What is it that as it were shows him the reality of these options?
Yeah, I mean, once he gets to the mountain, the mountain appears a lot steeper once he's facing it than it looked at a distance when he was talking to worldly wise man. So he's beginning to realize that these commandments of God, looked upon as means of salvation, accruing merit, are impossible. And that's reflected in the steepness of the mountain. Not to mention the fact that, there are stones and lightning flashing and, all of these other things gathering around him. And so he's paralyzed again. He's paralyzed just like he was back at the city of destruction. It's almost a return to that in some sense, and doesn't know where to go.
It's striking that he fears the mountain is going to fall down on top of him. He's going to be absolutely decimated by it.
Yeah.
And this draws him up short. He doesn't really ever make a home in the village of morality.
Yeah.
He despairs of ever achieving it. And then he encounters the evangelist again, and the evangelist sends him back on the way and leads him to sort of the sort of fourth turn here to the wicket gate. I don't know if Jonathan wanted to hit something before we leave.
I just want to touch on one more thing, because Jeff brought it up, and I do think it's interesting to think about. Jeff, how would you describe the difference between legality and civility? I mean, Mr. Legality and civility. You mentioned that there are distinctions, and there are, but they're subtle. Because their end is the same and their aim is the same, and in a sense their appeal is the same. But what is the distinction between legality and civility?
Yeah, I think the idea of legality is sort of adherence to the law, but the idea of civility is adherence to cultural codes and standards, right? One might be sort of a civil person, a gentleman type person, and one might be a legal person, right? Not caring at all what the civil codes might desire or demand. So, for instance, one, I think civil has a way of reflecting the traditions of say in this case, a church context, where the other one might be a person who desires to adhere to the law of God in order to gain merit for himself. I think that's
almost a positive law, natural law conformity, and that I could go either route and get myself right.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's right.
And probably it's the case that different churches, different visible churches might emphasize one of those or the other. I mean, you could be in the context of a visible church that is emphasizing your adherence to the law. It's countercultural, but it's not actually based on the work of Christ or the gospel. And civility would be something that really isn't very countercultural. It's just sort of being a better person within the society in which you're placed.
Yeah, because it might reflect the culture itself, really. And that might be your church context.
So church just kind of rounds you out as a culturally multifaceted man.
Yeah. One other thing I just want to plug before we leave this whole idea, because Evangelist is going to talk to him and give him these things. But one of the things that I always find fascinating is though he missed the steps in the Slough of Despond, it says Evangelist says to him some things, and it says, so he stood still and trembled. And when you think about the Westminster Confession and saving faith, faith is trembling at the threatenings, right? And so, I mean, Bunyan, I think, is indicating for us that this man has faith, but he's weak. He's trundling along, as it were.
He does finally come to the wicket gate, and when he gets, first couple things, Jeff. Why is it called the wicket gate? And then why does he get pulled into the wicket gate? In other words, it's a little dangerous as he stands there. There's an onslaught that comes against him. What does that represent?
Yeah, that's a great question, because oftentimes I think this has a tendency to be thought of as sort of the entryway into salvation. And I think Bunyan is maybe of two minds himself on this. When you read the second part of this, you get that sense. But if you read the Pilgrim's Progress, you don't get that sense. You're not sure anyway. You're not sure, at least. If, for instance, if it is the gate of salvation, then why does he still have the burden on his back immediately upon entering? But I found in my work, I found a book that he wrote 2 years prior to the publication of the Pilgrim's Progress. Progress was published in 1678. This book was written in 1676, and it's called The Straight Gate. And there's a footnote in that work. And here is where he identifies himself what the straight gate is. Now, let me just read it. Much confusion appears to exist in the mind of many in reference to the straight gate mentioned in the text, as this passage is frequently introduced into exhortations to the unconverted. He goes on to say, it is addressed to professors of religion, to those who profess to have set out for the celestial city, and seems to say, beware of the form of godliness without power, of the profession without possession. And so I think that Bunyan himself is saying that the straight gate is that striving to lay hold of what the celestial city promises. And so the straight gate could be put on any particular path of the journey from the beginning to the end. I think that's what the straight gate is. And the reason why the idea of striving is so important is, and that's, he gets pulled in, right? Because the devil is seeking to devour at any given point as well. And so he's pulled in. And the imagery is that there's a striving, there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of danger all along the way as one thinks about the straight gate.
So he comes in the straight gate, but really he's, in a certain sense, passing through the straightened way, really, yes, for the duration of the pilgrimage.
Yeah. Which is why that burden remains on his back, right? As the porter's there, I don't know. It's an interesting thing when you think about these different characters that you encounter along the way, whether it's evangelist or the porter. These are all the pastor along the way, because it's the pastor who can direct you safely from one.
I love that he calls him Goodwill, Mr. Goodwill. I mean, there's really something about pastoring there. Great heart in the second part, but Goodwill, in that he's telling him he's dragging him, he's pulling him, he's directing him. But there's that question of, well, how do I know that I'm on the path? how do I know that the path doesn't wander hither and yon? And he says the path is straight. So it does sound like this whole notion of straightness is from the beginning all the way through.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I think you asked Jonathan when we started this, why does this book have this draw? You can see yourself in it. And this is one of those points where you can it has the ability to take you by the heart. When evangelist asked Christian at the very beginning, do you see that gate? No, I don't see it. Do you see the light? Yeah, I see the light. But then when Mr. Worldly Wise Man asks him, do you see that mountain yonder? And, he's like, oh yeah, very clearly I see it. Right. And I just find myself thinking, this is so much like us, to not be able to see the best of things, but be able to see the worst of things so clearly. And, and here he is arriving at the gate, and it's just in one sense, it's a little triumph, and it's a lot of joy to see him move through this part of the path. Feels like life itself, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
Well, Jeff, this has really been this has exceeded our expectations, this discussion of Pilgrim's Progress, and so we're grateful for you giving us a little bit of your time. We look forward to future discussions as we move beyond the wicket gate to the interpreter's house next time and beyond. And so, Jeff, really can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Well, I can't thank you enough for asking me. I really enjoyed being with you guys. So thank you very much.